So in this, our second lecture under this topic, we're going to focus on the seasoning of timber. So it's important to know that green or unseasoned timber, so that's basically the log that has just been cut, contains a large amount of water. And seasoning is simply the controlled drying out of most of the water from the cell cavities and the cell walls in order to, and there's a few things that we want to achieve here. So in order to reduce shrinkage, warping and checking to a minimum. And again, we're coming across some terminology here, warping and checking in particular, which you might be unfamiliar with, but we are going to clarify that shortly. It also reduces weight considerably with a consequent reduction in freight charges. It reduces the likelihood of attack by wood-boring insects. Usually wood-boring insects require a certain level of moisture to be successful. Also to prevent blue stain and attack by other moulds such as decay fungi, dry rot and wet rot are two examples. It also increases the strength of the wood, and down the track when it's being used, it improves bonding properties so that adhesives, paints and finishes adhere better and they last longer on the timber. It also makes the timber lighter and easier to work with. Now, the aim of seasoning is not to dry the water completely from the wood, which under normal conditions of use always contains some moisture. The moisture content of freshly sawn timber often exceeds the weight of the wood itself. So going back to that point before about reducing shipping costs, this is the evidence here. For example, in green radiata pine, moisture content is frequently greater than 200%. So it really means that the majority of the weight at that point, when it's first cut down, is actually water, and it's not the timber itself. The ideal moisture content for seasoned timber varies with the relative humidity and temperature of the air. So for example, it would even depend on where in Australia the timber is going to be used and the prevailing climate in that particular area. So for example, we're going to talk about EMC, or equilibrium moisture content, and a number 12% will come up. Now, 12% is a really good rule of thumb EMC for timber in the Sydney area. It would be fairly consistent for most of southeastern Australia. So to keep timber swelling or movement to a minimum, timber should be seasoned to the equilibrium moisture content, EMC, of the locality where it is to be used. Now, shrinkage takes place during the process of seasoning. This occurs when the cell walls start to give up their combined moisture, and it continues until seasoning is complete. Eventually, a point of equilibrium is reached where the vapour pressure from the water in the timber equals the vapour pressure in the surrounding atmosphere. And as humidity changes, such as in periods of rain or drought, so too does the moisture content of the wood, unless it is totally sealed from the atmosphere, which is just one of the reasons for lacquering, waxing or oiling a project. So you can see from this image here, there's three phases that take place. And this is kind of some images of a close-up of what the cells might look like. So initially, everything is saturated, the cell walls are saturated, and also the space inside the cells is saturated, is full of moisture. So when we're talking about, radiata pine being 200% the weight, 200% of it is water, this is what we're looking at here. Now, initially what happens is it's the free moisture, so it's the moisture that's in the cavities in the timber. It dries out first, but the walls remain saturated, so no shrinkage occurs. In the third image, this is where you can start to see the shrinkage, because this is where the moisture is coming out of the cell walls. Now, if you look carefully at the image, you'll see that the cell has not shrunk much in length, it's shrunk in girth. So very little shrinkage takes place along the grain because the cells do not shrink to any extent in their length. The medullary rays, which are long, thin cells running at right angles to the growth rings, restrict radial shrinkage as well. Therefore, most shrinkage takes place in the direction of the growth rings. This is called tangential shrinkage. Tangential shrinkage is about double that of radial shrinkage and about 100 times greater than longitudinal shrinkage. And so down below there you can see sort of the effects of shrinkage in terms of how a log or how a cut log might shrink. So back-sawn boards tend to cup away from the heart, and that's because of tangential shrinkage being double that of radial shrinkage. Quarter-sawn boards retain their shape well during shrinkage. Wide boards, such as core stock, should be built up with heart sides alternating to minimise the effects of shrinkage. So say, for example, if you were joining or making a tabletop joining lots of narrower boards, you want to alternate the heart sides. Now, there are three main methods of seasoning commonly used in Australia. There's air seasoning, and it's also known as the natural drying method. Now, the image over on the right-hand side highlights, what I'm about to say. So the timber is stored in stacks under cover, but otherwise in the open, so that it dries slowly in natural weather conditions. And what I mean by undercover is you can actually make the stack, and it kind of becomes the structure, and then you put some sort of roof directly onto the stack itself. Efficient air seasoning requires good air circulation, and this is achieved by laying the stack of timber clear of the ground and separated by strips of dry wood, usually about 20 millimetres thick and 25 to 40 millimetres wide. These must be placed exactly one above the other so as to not cause distortion in the boards. Strips in each layer should be placed at 500 to 1000 millimetre intervals, and that'll just depend on the thickness of the timber that's being dried. Stacks should be protected from the sun and weather. The ends of the boards are usually sealed with a thick coat of paint or a specialist oil to stop the end grain from drying out too quickly. Air seasoning takes approximately 6 months for every 25 millimetres of timber thickness. However, the time varies according to several factors such as the species of the timber, the size of the boards, season and climatic conditions, the location and the method of stacking that's used. Okay, so the next seasoning method is kiln seasoning, and it has some advantages over air seasoning, and they include the seasoning time can be reduced considerably. So for every 25 millimetres of timber thickness, green timber takes between 1 to 3 weeks to kiln dry, compared with 6 months for air drying. So if you think about that in terms of just being able to harvest timber, prepare it, convert it, prepare it for sale, and then being able to sell the timber, there is an advantage there, obviously. Another advantage of the method is that it can very accurately control the moisture content of the wood. So you can actually get the wood consistently to a very specific predetermined content, scientifically or computer control. Kiln seasoning, like air seasoning, requires the careful stacking of the timber. Wood is placed on special trucks and wheeled into oven-like rooms called kilns, where heat and humidity is carefully controlled. The timber is dried using air circulated by fans over steam-heated coils, with steam inlets supplying moisture to control the humidity. During the early stages of the drying process, care must be exercised to ensure that the free moisture in the cell cavities is not drawn off too rapidly, as this could result in a defect known as collapse, and you can see there's an example of it there. Collapse is a flattening of softwood cell structure, causing distortion, severe shrinkage, and a large loss in overall strength of the timber. Kiln seasoning is well suited to softwoods because they're not prone to collapse as much as hardwoods are, and the entire seasoning process may be completed in the kilns. For hardwoods, it is more economical to air dry to fibre saturation point, so that's about 30% of moisture content, and then kiln dry to EMC, which is about 12%, as this keeps degradation to a minimum. It also reduces costs as well. Something that we didn't really discuss here is, in terms of one of the other disadvantages of kiln seasoning, is of course the cost. You've got to put a lot of energy into the process. Now there's two types of kilns that are used for the seasoning process. There's compartment kilns and progressive kilns. The majority of kilns used in Australia are the compartment type, which lends itself to an economical arrangement for combined air and kiln seasoning. These kilns offer greater control over the drying process for individual stacks. And the reality is, in Australia, many mills are actually, seasoning different species of timber at the same time, and compartment kilns are particularly suited for this. Now, a progressive kiln is similar to an assembly line. Truckloads of timber are moved progressively along the kiln so that the green timber added at the cool, moist end is gradually dried as it slowly moves along. It emerges at the hot, dry end, ready for use. Progressive kilns lack the flexibility of compartment kilns and are suitable only when a continuous supply of timber of the same species and thickness is available. Of course, there's a substantial advantage there in its efficiency of being able to move very, very large amounts of timber through in a continuous basis. Now, progressive kilns are not widely used in Australia, although they are more widely used in Europe and North America, because there are many technical problems involved in their control, particularly as most timber mills are required to season a wide range of timber species. So the advantages of kiln seasoning include a significant reduction in the time required for seasoning. It's very good for destroying insects and fungi. The reduction and precise control of moisture content to a desired level, and a measure of control to minimise the causes of seasoning defects. And as we mentioned before, one of the main disadvantages is just the cost. Combined seasoning seeks to take advantages of the strengths of both air seasoning and kiln seasoning. And this is where the timber is first air seasoned for about 3 months until the free moisture in the cell cavities has dried out. Refer back to the image earlier. This avoids the main disadvantage of kiln seasoning, namely distortion and checking due to rapid removal of the free moisture from the outer wood cell cavities. The timber is then kiln dried for between 3 to 7 days to remove the combined moisture from the cell walls. The final moisture content can be precisely regulated so that the timber can be used either indoors or outside. Other than air seasoning, combined seasoning is the most common form of seasoning used in Australia.